So now that we have our flocking simulation set up with the particles and the modifiers working together to create this cohesive, flowing kind of flocking system, we're going to actually look at putting a bug on each particle and having it look like a swarm of insects. And we're going to have a look at how to actually animate that insect and create an animated loop, and why we have to work with point level animation as well. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off, pretty much the same scene as we had before. Obviously you guys will be provided with the start file, so just pick that one up. The only difference to the scene as you left it in the last tutorial is that I've added a vibrate tag to the helper object, tweaked a couple of the strength and fall off settings, and I've put the trails back on. I've also just grouped the avoid objects and put a display tag on them because I prefer this way of displaying them. So we're going to actually put an insect onto each of these particles, and obviously to generate geometry on particles you need an XP generator. So we're going to pause that, go to the generators tab here, and I'm going to go to XP generator. There we go. I can turn off the trails actually right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to need a piece of geometry to put in there. And what I have up here, let's go and have a look at what I have up here. So let's go back to the beginning. We have a bug. Let me just solo this out. So it's the only thing I'm seeing in the scene. So what we have is actually one mesh, and it's a bug. And it's actually a baked out point level animation creature. And the reason for that is the XP generator, to be able to kind of offset the animation and do some tricks with it, it needs to be point level animation, not just PSR animation or tags or anything that would deform, that kind of thing. It'll ignore those, but it respects point level animation, and it can actually do some cool things with it. So he's not a hugely high poly mesh. You don't want to go too crazy, although of course you can subdivide this guy. And you can see each point has a keyframe, and if I just let this play on loop, it's actually 59 frames. So if I actually go to that, because it's a full 60 frame loop, as he comes back around to the beginning again, you can see it's got this nice cycling animation. So what we need to do is a few things to prepare him for animating inside the particle system. So let's unsolo and let's throw him in the generator and see what happens. So let's go back here, press play. Oh, first thing, I need to associate the emitter with the generator. So select the generator, throw the emitter inside, and all hell breaks loose because there's tons of them. So I'm going to need to reduce their size for starters. Currently it's scaling using the particle scale, and that's actually what we're going to end up using, but I'll show you what happens when I use particle radius. So particle radius is cool because it's nice and small, and I can show the particles as well as the geometry. Oop, there we go. And I'm going to change the display mode of the emitter to one that shows the radius better. So circle. And you can see our little guy, he's inside the particle. And he's sort of basically, his bounding box is the radius. Now there is an issue here. As he goes along his animation cycle, his bounding box changes. So if I just make a copy of him out here, turn this off actually. In fact, I could have just turned that off. Don't know why I did that. You can see his bounding box is actually changing over time. So how could I show that? There's a bit of a trick actually. Maybe I can drop a spline wrap in there if it updates. There we go. Oh, that works. That was a bit of a Hail Mary there, but anyway. So you can see the bounding box changes, and the radius will be maintained. So what will happen is our little guy will be scale as he animates, and the bounding box gets smaller. He'll scale up because the radius has to be maintained. So the smallest value of the bounding box will be multiplied to make sure the radius is respected. So we actually do need to use the particle scale and not radius. That's just something to be aware of with animated geometry in a particle. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go back to our generator, change it back to scale using particle scale, and then I'm going to scale him down. So I could either use the source scale or I could use the emitter scale, which I think is going to be the best. So I'm going to go to emission, and I'm going to go down here to scale, and then I'm going to go to start with 0.1, and it's a multiple of his original size, so 0.1 times whatever his size was. That's looking pretty good. And you can already see he's got some cool stuff going on where he's kind of following the particles. That's cool. It's a little bit slow, and it can get slow with like lots of geometry being duplicated. You can use render instances, but we can't use render instances if we're using animated geometry. So I can use, whilst I'm sort of bug busting things, I definitely didn't mean that pun, is that we can use render instances and the playback is way quicker. So that might just use that for when you don't need to see them animated, you just want to get the motion, and you'll see it's so much smoother. We're getting like 75 FPS there. There's another issue there you'll notice, and that is that the original bug that's being cloned or instanced is actually, it displays in the viewport, and it displays in the render as well. So you need to hide him somehow, and you can't just hide him because that's he's being instanced. So you actually need to move him out the way. It's a bit of a limitation. It's actually quite annoying, but all you need to do though is just fire him off on one axis miles away, and he's gone. So just be aware of that. That's a bit of an annoyance, but just make sure he's away from the camera. So anyway, we're looking at something pretty cool looking here. And they're following tangentially, so you can see they're all facing the right way. If you ever need to slow down a simulation, by the way, just to kind of see how things are going, you can actually use the retiming slider in the emitter. So if I drop that down right now, you see there we get this multiplied slowdown, just so that I can go and investigate, make sure all the orientations are good, and they are, so that's great. But now we need to actually have some animation applied to these dudes. So I'm gonna just I'm gonna put the retiming back to 100%. Go back over here to where the emitter begins. Let's just show the emitter actually. There we go. And there's a couple of things actually I should note here, and that is that he's not centered on the particle, and that's because the generator is using the source geometry's original axis. So you can see that that's where the center of the particle is, and he's offset from that. Now, because it's point level animation, if I grab this sort of axis here in axis mode, which you click on over here, and I move it up to kind of put it to the center of his body, and I press play, he just jumps up. And that's because all those keyframes that are on those points are relative to this original axis. So what we need to do is we need to put him in a null, and then we can move him inside that null. So that's just the way you do this. So just drag him down, so he's kind of on 0, 0, 0, roughly. Just trying to get rough center of mass, because you might want it to be on his head or the main part of the body. In general, it's the center of mass you're going to want it on, and where he's flying around this. So if I just check where our null is, if you hold 7 down, by the way, this is a trick as well. You can move the parent without moving the child. So you want to do that like that. So I'm holding 7 down and moving the null a bit more further up onto his thorax. Okay, cool. So, and also I've got him kind of tilted, but that's kind of a natural position for them when they're in flight, creatures like this. Their back end kind of is heavier, so it sort of, they have that orientation. So I'm happy with the orientation. But if you needed to, let me just put the generator on so you can see exactly what's going to happen here. So if I put the particle display on as well. Oh, geometry and particles is on. Oh, there you can actually see. So you can actually see the particle radius. Now, this is the other thing. The emitter is just showing the radius. So if we want to kind of match the radius roughly to the scale, we can do that. So let's press play. This would come in useful later on. It's not necessary, but it would come in use later on if you needed to, say, have a collision system, so where they collide with each other. But otherwise, I think that's okay. So I'll leave them at that kind of radius, and I will go back to the beginning, press play, and you can see his animation is a kind of not looping at the moment, which is an issue, but he is centered, which is great. And also, if I rotate him inside the null, you can see that it's like an offset. So this is the easiest way. There are kind of other ways where you can kind of manually do it inside the generator. So you can go, instead of rotating using the particle rotation, you can change it to offset particle rotation, and then you can kind of tweak all these settings. But I find it so much easier to use this null trick. So I'm just going to call it rotation null, so we know what it is later on. And I'm going to move him miles away again, just to... Oh no, actually we're going to deal with the looping animation first. So to see the animation in the actual particles, the generated geometry on the particles, we actually need to go back to the straight clone mode. And this is a much heavier mode for the system to handle, but it allows us to use animation stuff. And also you can see the colors respected. So obviously we're not going to use these colors, but it's kind of a handy way to kind of get some variation in there anyway. And a little bonus. Now I'm going to turn off the modifiers. I'm going to turn off the flock modifier, and I'm going to have the particles emit out with 0 speed. Currently they emit at 150. We don't want that. I just want to see, there we go. I just want to see them in place, and I want to see their animations kind of going. This is just a good way to see the animations. So I know that the animation loop is around 60 frames, 59 frames actually. And what we'll see when I press play is that there is some sort of offset where, so each particle is emitted, that's the point at which the emission begins. So, and that's because I'm emitting over 30 frames. So technically the last animated creature should be at very latest the 90th frame, and that looks about right. Yeah, so there we go. They stop moving around 90. But we obviously want that to keep looping and looping and looping. But unfortunately, there's no quick way of doing that in the generator, so we'll have to do that in the timeline of Cinema 4D. It's pretty easy, a little bit fiddly to start with, but once you know it's there, it's really, really useful and powerful. And like I said before, if your objects have to be point level baked animation for this to work. No other animation will work. So let's turn our generator off, and let's work with our big master creature. Let me turn the system off. So what I've done there is I've just hit the system object enabled tick, and that just disables everything temporarily. And I do that a lot. You'll find yourself turning things on and off as you go. So let's see what the animation's doing. So we've got this nice loop. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set the timeline to that maximum time length. And this would come under preparing assets for, animation to be used in particles. So I've got him playing there. You've got this cool loop, but we need to go and have a look at these keyframes. So if I press Shift F3 brings up our timeline, and we can have a look. If we expand the Beetle baked, if you're not seeing any objects in here, you can drag it in from the object manager, or check your settings in the view settings. That everyone has different preferences here, but you'll tend to want to use, sort of some of these. If you can't see the animation, it's probably because of one of those view settings. Anyway, so what I need to do is I need to have this loop, and what I normally would do with animation that I'm going to loop, so keyframes, is to use just the repetition on the time track. But unfortunately, on a PLA time track, or a PLA track, sorry, you don't get the option to loop things. So what we need to do is we need to actually add something called a time track. And you can see there's actually an input here, and we're going to put one in here in a minute. And I'll add one now. So you right-click the object, add special tracks, time track. This is a super powerful tool for retiming animations. If you look here, I'll play the animation. If I take this time track, I need to associate it. So first of all, let's expand it to see what we're getting. So essentially, the time is at 0% here and 100% by the time it gets to the end of the timeline. And this is the reason that I just clipped it to the time frame of the full cycle. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually associate this time track with this PLA track. So I just click on the PLA track, get the picker for the time track, and I'm going to pick that time track. And you can rename these, so I can just check that it's the right one, make sure it's all good. If I just rename it, go back to the PLA, and you can see it's definitely the correct one. So what can you do with this now? So I could actually shorten our animation. So it's if you notice, it did the full loop in 30 frames there. It's the whole thing in 10 frames is instant. I might have it actually going this fast, but we can actually use a scale value in the XP generator for that. So no need to worry about that, retiming it. All we're looking for is the looping parameters. So luckily we have the the looping ability in the time track. And if you look down here, so you'll select the time track, and in your attributes window, you'll see this after option. And this is the track, what to do with the track after you get to the end. So we want it, currently it's constant, so it means that it's it remains whatever the value at the end of the time track is, keep that value forever. What we want it to do is we want it to repeat the cycle. So we want it to repeat the loop. And this option down here is repeat. And we can actually expand the timeline out back to 500 frames. And you can see he continues to loop. But he stops at a frame 120, or just two frames short of that. And that's because you actually have to set how many repetitions. Now I want it to go on forever, but I just want to demonstrate something here. So I'm going to set it to 50 repetitions. No, let's say 20 repetitions. So, you know, that's a good 300 frames worth minimum of animation. But when we go back to our generator, we'll see what the issue with that is. So, okay, we've got our looping going on. Let's check back all the generator stuff back on and the system back on. Let's make sure they animate beyond the 60 frames. And they do. They keep going and keep going and keep going. Awesome. Oh, it's not. It's more than that, isn't it? It's actually 1200 frames. I've just realized my maths is terrible. So let's go back here. Change the repetitions to say 5. So that is the 300. And we should see that we run out of repetitions. And my point with this is that if you're going to retime the animation as well, like if we're going to speed it up, we'd be without loops. And you can see there your animation is finishing beyond that 300 point plus or minus 30 frames. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to make sure that we have enough repetitions to cover everything. And just to prove the point about you need to have this just in case. In the generator, you can actually scale the animation. So if I put it to 20%, I get a slow motion occurring. And that's really cool. But if I go the other way, say 5 times faster, 500%, you can see, and we finish 5 times earlier than it should do. So we need to just all we need to do is basically make sure that the time track has, you know, way more repetitions than we're ever going to need. So I can just go over the top here. It doesn't really matter. So 100,000, or is that a million even? We're never going to get to that millionth repetition, but it's just there if we need it. So there we go. We're never going to run out. There we go. And that speed is actually not too far off what I'd want it, because it's insects, obviously. And that's why I had you want the animation to be nice and smooth. So I animated it at that 60 frame loop, but I knew that I was going to speed it up in the generator. And you can see if I go 1,000, it's flittering probably more realistically, honestly. However, I don't think I'll have it at 1,000%. I think I'll have it at 400 maybe. And you have to go back to the beginning to see the change, by the way. So there we go. Cool. So I think now we've got the animation sorted, we can actually just get them floating around, flocking, and see what that looks like. So let's turn the flock modifier back on. And I tell you what, I'm going to turn the particle display off and have geometry only display on. Here we go. So they are flocking quite aggressively together. And they look pretty cool. Obviously, apart from their multicolor, you got some fairly authentic movement. You might want to speed up the animation. They do look a bit slow. But they are doing their flocking behavior. Awesome. So this could be a bird, this could be, you know, anything that flies, and also creatures that are on the floor as well. So, and fish, you'd have a fish obviously waving its tail fin and fins to swim, and you could create a loop for that as well. But I just love this because you can actually, so if I actually emitted all the particles at once, so let me turn the flock back off, take the speed off. Oh, the speed's already off, so that's fine. And I emit them all on one frame. So if I do a shot emission, let's do, oh no, that's way too many. Let's go for something like 20. There we go. So if I slow the animation back down again by going into here and doing like a 50% speed, get this nice, beautiful slow-mo going on. What we can do is we can actually offset that animation. So currently you'll see they're perfectly in sync, which is obviously not very realistic. So what we do is we have this option here to randomly offset the particles. That's, sorry, the generated geometry on the particles. So you can see now they're not all at the same time. Some are obviously going to be close because it's only 60 frames worth. If I increase the speed, we'll see. And there we go. We get a really nice organic offset animation. Put our flock back on, put our turbulence on maybe, just to have a bit of an extra one. And we can increase the numbers here, but it is going to get slower, so just beware. I'm actually on quite an old CPU, so you guys on a newer system will have no problems with this. I'm actually going to put no intersection on in our emitter, so that when we emit, I'll never emit two sort of flies or beetles in the same place. So let me change the no intersection to, say, 30. There we go. So if you look here, there's no intersecting bugs anymore, no intersecting beetles. Press play. Let's increase the number. Go back to our rate mode. Let's have them stop emitting on 40, and let's double the amount. And so you can see the playback drops to, sub 10 frame playback speeds. So that's no good for reviewing things. So that's where I said you would jump back and forth from maybe the render instance mode, because then obviously you need to hide the beetle. Get them off screen. There you go. You get the playback again, no problem, but you do lose the animation. So you might want to be toggling between these before you go to final render, that kind of thing. Or the safer workflow is to go back to the generator, go to straight clone mode, and render out a viewport preview of this. And I might just do that now just to show you guys what this is going to look like when the animation is finished. Not going to render this one. I might render the next one, but for now we're just using it as the particle system demonstration. And it's pretty cool. I think I really like this one because you can get some seriously cool... Look at them, disgusting little creatures and critters flying all over the place. And you can use any modifier with these guys now as well. So you can add in different different effects. So I've got the turbulence mod obviously coming in, but you could use some follow spline action. You could do some follow surface, which is exactly what we're going to do in the next one, where we have critters walking along the floor instead of flying. So yeah, it's a pretty endless kind of system options and tweakability. And you can have them change in scale if you wanted to. So you could have them go through a force field and increase in size in some horror kind of thing. But yeah, options are endless. So we're going to move on next to the surface cloning, or a surface crowd simulation style thing. And that will be the last part of this project.